ka neid, tänu kellele see üritus täna toimub. Selle ürituse korraldamisele aitasid siis kaasa Vabaühenduste Fond ja Kodanikuühiskonna Sihtkapital. Aga tänu Ameerika Ühendriikide saatkonnale, nagu te näete, see on ka põhjus, miks meil on siin Ameerika Ühendriikide lipp, on meil siis rõõm siin tervitada ka tänast väliskülalist Steven Clifti. E-Riigi Akadeemia poolt ma annaksin sõna, mina olen E-Riigi Akadeemia kohalike omavalitsuste programmi juht, aga ma annaksin võib-olla sisusse minekuks sõna kõigepealt Ivar Tallole, kes korra käin ka läbi veel enne ajakava, et me ootame siia iga minut saabuma Rait Marustet põhiseaduskomisjonist, kes meid siis võõrustajate poolt oli palutud tervitama, väidetavalt ta laev kohe on randumas, nii et me tõesti ei oska garanteerida, kas ta jõuab meile siia esimesse plokki, nii nagu planeeritud, aga lisaks nüüd juhtus midagi, millele... Lisaks sellele siis ka veel Liia Hänni teeb teile veel ka avatud valitsemisse sellise paarilauselise sissejuhatuse ja siis juba anname pikemaks ettekandeks, mis on siis täidetud ka paljude heade näidetega mujalt maailmast Steven Cliftile ja siis on meil väike Eesti sessioon alates kella 11, kus on meil erinevaid lahendusi tulnud esitlema mitmed nii-öelda kogukonna lahenduste eestvedajad ja kogukonna aktivistid. Siis pakutakse siin väikest lõunaoodet ja viimaks on siis 1 ja 3/4 kestev selline töötuba, kus me üritame teid jagada niimoodi, et igas lauas oleks nii omavalitsuste esindajaid kui ka siis kogukonna esindajaid. Paraku IT-kogukonna esindajaid on siin täna väga väike hulk, aga loodetavasti siis igasse lauda jätkub ka neid inimesi, kes tehnoloogilist poolt esindavad ja Steven on lubanud siis ka käia lauast lauda ja te võite, Steven esineb siis nii-öelda eksperdina, kes tuleb ja annab oma sisendi aruteludesse, kes ei jäta ühtegi lauda siis ilma ja meil on ka täna siin sünkroontõlge, nii et Steveni kõnet on võimalik siis ka kuulda eesti keelde tõlgituna. Aga nüüd Ivar, palun.
Tere hommikust kõigile. Hea meel teid siin näha, hea meel jälle nentida, et 9 aastat tagasi alustatud või 8 aastat ja natukene tagasi alustatud e-demokraatia programm E-Riigi Akadeemias ainult edeneb ja aitab Eesti ühiskonnal mõtestada seda, kuidas uusi tehnoloogiaid paremini integreerida meie tavaellu ja seda just siis poliitika poole pealt. Ja selles puhul mina ei hakka täna sisust rääkima, mina tahaksin lihtsalt tutvustada proua Liia Hännit, kes on meie e-demokraatia programmi vedanud 9 aastat, nüüd hakkab kohe 10. peale, mille üle me kõik oleme väga uhked. Liia Hännist on vahepeal saanud juba päris tunnustatud rahvusvaheline ekspert, nii et ei ole siin tegemist mitte enam kodukootud inimesega, vaid täitsa tunnustatud eksperdiga. Palun, Liia, räägi meile siis sellest, kuidas see avatud valitsemise partnerlus välja näeb.
Nii, aitäh, Ivar. Hea, et sa seekord lühidalt tegid ja minu personaalküsimusel liiga pikalt ei peatunud. Aga mina tahaksin alustada oma lühikest sõnavõttu sellega, et kõigepealt õnnitleda meie siiani veel värske mandaadiga kohalikku võimu ja soovida teile palju jõudu ja edu, sest teie kätes on kohalik valitsemine, kohalik demokraatia ja loodetavasti ka kohalik e-demokraatia. Aga täna selles näete te siin pildil hoopis mitte demokraatiat, vaid avatud valitsemist. Ja on ju nii, et heal lapsel on mitu nime, hea valitsemine, demokraatlik valitsemine, väga hea valitsemine, aga nüüd siis miks me räägime praegu avatud valitsemisest? kohe ma esitan teile ühe kavala küsimuse selle kohta ja vaatan, kas keegi oskab siin vastata, mis värk on. Kohe, ma ei taha seda uut versiooni. Nii. Näete seda triibumustrit, jah? Väga hea. Kas keegi tunneb ära, mis triipkood või seelikumuster see on? Kes aimab? Ei, Ivar ütles ära, et see on tegelikult üks uus triipkood küll. Ja see on avatud valitsemise partnerluse triipkood ja see kaup on meile tulnud nii-öelda rahvusvaheliselt tasandilt selline initsiatiiv nagu Open Government Partnership või siis eesti keeles avatud valitsemise partnerlus on selle triipkoodi autor ja see rahvusvaheline initsiatiiv on siis alanud 2011. aasta sügisel selle mõttega, et innustada riikide valitsusi arendama demokraatlikku valitsemist, avatud valitsemist, mis siis nagu tähendab seda, et võimutegevus oleks läbipaistev, et kodanikud oleks kaasas poliitika kujundamise ja otsustamisega ja et toimuks leppimatu võitlus korruptsiooniga. Ja selle avatud valitsemise üks mõte on see, et tehnoloogia ja see, et rahvad on suundumas infoühiskonda, annab nagu uusi võimalusi selleks, et need suured eesmärgid, avatud valitsemise põhimõtted teoks teha. Ja see initsiatiiv on siis haaranud väga palju riike, sealhulgas ka Eesti. Nimelt 19. aprillil eelmisel aastal Brasiilias Eesti valitsus otsustas liituda selle rahvusvahelise initsiatiiviga. Võib-olla kellel on hea nägemine, aga siin see pilt on äärmiselt udune, siin on üks sinise lipsuga tegelane, kes on meie välisminister ja tema on siis see ametiisik, kes tahtis või kes võttis nõuks viia siis rahvusvahelisele tasandile Eesti soov liituda avatud valitsemise partnerlusega ja tunnustada täielikult neid põhimõtteid, mida ma just äsja teile siin näitasin, see on läbipaistvus, kodanike kaasamine, võitlus korruptsiooniga. Ma ei tea, kas te olete märganud, et Eesti on selle rahvusvahelise initsiatiivi liige? Kas te olete märganud seda, et need põhimõtted on siis meie igapäevases valitsemise praktikas teoks saanud? See on küsimärk meile kõigile, aga igatahes olgu selle riigi tasandiga lugu, kuidas on. Kohalikul võimul on värske mandaat ja ka valimislubadused valitseda ja teostada võimu veidi teisiti ja paremini ja dialoogis kodanikega, kui see varem juhtus. Ja selleks, et need avatud valitsemise põhimõtted tõesti sõnadest jõuaks tegudesse, ongi meie tänane inspiratsiooniseminar mõeldud selleks, et kuuleksite, mida tehakse rahvusvaheliselt ja ka Eesti paremaid näiteid ja mõtleksite seda kõike oma valla või linna jaoks, et siis juba avatud valitsemine seal koos oma inimestega teoks teha, nii et palju edu ja jõudu tänaseks seminariks ja ideede tulevärki ja las olla siis igal omavalitsusel oma hea triibukood selleks, et avatud valitsemine teoks teha. Aitäh!
Nii, ja nagu me praegu kogeme, ei ole kõik meie sõbralikud niimoodi rahvusvahelised kontaktid kohale jõudnud, ehk siis teisisõnu, härra Maruste pole veel, takso pole siia sisse sõitnud, aga meil on lääne poolt sõitnud külla Steven Clift, kes ei ole sugugi mitte esimest korda Eestimaal. Me kutsusime ta Eestisse, kas see oli 2005 või 2006, ja sellest on meie esimene kontakt. Täna on mul rõõm teda jälle tervitada ja öelda teile kõigile, et tegemist on ühe esimese sellise pioneeriga, nagu organisatsioonina siinpool maailmanurgas olime meie need, kes e-demokraatiaga tegelema hakkas. Ameerikas üks esimesi selliseid noori tublisid inimesi, kes hakkas mõtlema, et kuidas tehnoloogia mõjutab siis poliitilisi protsesse, oli Steven Clift ja ta on sellele teemale truuks jäänud nüüd juba vaata et 20 aasta jooksul, nii et ma arvan, et ta on igatepidi väärikas selline ressurss, et kuulata ja mõtestada läbi seda, mida temal on meile pakkuda, kuidas meie saame olla inspiratsiooniks ka tema töödele, eks seda kõike see päev näitab, aga nüüd ma annan siis sõna Steven. Why don't you come here and tell us about what you have experienced, what you feel? I understand your latest work is mostly on local level and going even to the very borough level. So it's kind of exciting. I mean, finally we are not just having this kind of just big ideas, but just us as people doing things. So please.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to Estonia a second time. It is a great pleasure, a great honor. It all started when I sent out an email and I said on this locals online network that I run, this online forum, I said, I'm going to be in Europe. Anybody want me to stop by? And Martin here replied, and Hannes Ostuk, who's involved with EGA, made a connection, and they connected and helped make this visit possible. I have the honor also of stopping in Helsinki, and then after this conference in Europe, the World Forum for Democracy, I'll have a chance to stop in London. So this is one of my 4 stops, and I couldn't be more delighted to start in such a beautiful city and to have spent the last 2 days just kind of walking around and getting adjusted to the time. So they call it an inspiration seminar. I have some good news or bad news, I guess. I believe it's a perspiration seminar, right? This is hard work. Changing the way democracy and communities work using technology is not something that just happens. It happens because we work hard. And because I like to be an active speaker, I'm going to take off my jacket. And even roll up my sleeves a little bit here. Okay, so I have to apologize in advance. I have more slides than time. I know that's a fact. And so these slides are available right there from that link. And so, don't worry about taking notes. So many of the links that are blue are built right into the slide presentation on SlideShare. So that's just one thing I wanted to point out. So a welcome to Minnesota. I'm very excited to come somewhere where it's a little bit warmer than where I'm from. In fact, the weather, when I looked at the weather, I thought, boy, it's kind of chilly in Estonia because we had very warm weather in Minnesota, but 2 nights ago it was minus 15 Celsius back home, and so you are definitely warmer than we are at this week anyway. To sort of connect with you in the cold climate, this is my daughter and my wife, ice fishing in Minnesota. We come from a hardy land where people know how to work hard, and we have a tradition of collaboration and cooperation so we don't all freeze to death, all right? So, Minnesota, a few things about it. We're the red state right in the middle, right up here, so next to Canada. And about 5 million people live in Minnesota. That's about half the size of Sweden, just to give you a sense of scale, and about half the population of Sweden. Third most connected on the internet of states in the United States. We're an early pioneer of mainframe computing back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. A new book just came out describing that, and we are essentially wiped out by the personal computer. I had a chance to walk through some of the downtown Tallinn shopping malls, and it reminded me that Minnesota was the place where they invented the indoor shopping mall back in 1956. We're also where Post-it notes, this incredible communications tool, was invented by 3M. You may have heard of 3M. That used to stand for Minnesota Mining and manufacturing. That's where the 3 M's come from. And we also had a famous governor in 1998 who used the internet in part to get elected. He is a former pro wrestler, Jesse Ventura. So those are some things to know about Minnesota. I worked back in 1993 to 98 for the state of Minnesota, the state government. I helped create the state of Minnesota's website, the portal, the first website for the state. And uniquely, I also created a nonprofit, an NGO, called eDemocracy, which created the world's first election information website. I could say I was 10 when I did that, but I would be lying. But I was 25 when I created eDemocracy. And the key thing to note is that I had this unique perspective of being government by day and citizen by night. So I won't tell you about our mission, but we try to do good. And I work for the nonprofit full time now. I spent 10 years or so speaking for a living and consulting overseas. No one would pay me a dime in the United States to talk about democracy. But overseas, people were really interested, right? And the honest truth is that I began gathering stories from Estonia and Finland and Australia and put together sort of the story of how national governments, in particular, were using the internet to open up democracy, while volunteering in my home state of Minnesota, while going very, very deep in my own community. And so what I decided to do is basically have a very backwards presentation in the sense that I'm starting with the idea of my neighborhood, of things very, very local, and what we've been doing for the last 5 years in my neighborhood, as well as another 30 neighborhoods across Minneapolis and St. Paul. The Twin Cities has about 3 million people. The 2 cities together in the metro area, there's 400,000 people in the largest city, Minneapolis, where I live, and 270,000 in St. Paul. So you get a sense of the scale. So, you know, these are where we have a lot of our forums in these various neighborhoods, district councils, depending upon which city you're in, they have different names. And we try to go for 10% of households, and I'll tell you more about that as we go forward. But the general idea is this: creating an online public space where people in the community can talk, can communicate about things that matter to them. So there was a story in Powderhorn Park, a neighborhood of about 10,000 people. About 1,000 people were connected. That's about 20% of households. And someone was, they sent an email or a post to the forum, and they said, "I'm at the cabin in Wisconsin, it's next door state, and I just found out that our wheel of cheese has gone missing." He worked for a organic dairy that was competing in this national competition in Seattle. They found out from Homeland Security that you cannot overnight something in the United States that weighs more than a pound. Who would have known? And so he basically said, "Is anybody in my neighborhood going to Seattle in the next 24 hours? Lo and behold, a neighbor replied and said, "I'm a retired flight attendant for Northwest Airlines. I've always been looking for a reason to go to Seattle." So they hooked her up with a wheel of cheese at a local cheese shop, but it was intact, and they brought it to the national cheese competition within 24 hours. It would have been great if they'd won, but they didn't win the competition, but this was a very famous story on all the cheese blogs, apparently. So here's my neighborhood, Standish Erickson. It's actually 2 neighborhoods with about 10,000 residents. This little yellow house here, that's where I live, right there. This is where my children go to school. It's a grade school across the street. So I know I like things to be very local. You also note I have an open front porch. Many American homes in the 60s when they began filling in their porches, but my house was very run down apparently, and no one ever took care of it, and so now I have the advantage of having a nice open porch. And I view this neighborhood as one with small homes and very big hearts. So it's a very special community, and there are a lot of new young families that have been moving in. So it's very much an old new place, if you will, in U.S. standards. So my house is 100 years old, for example. And as they say, this is Tip O'Neill, the former U.S. Speaker of the House, talked about all politics as local. So now we're really local. So here's just the concept. I mean, how simple is an online space for a neighborhood? We basically share an email inbox. That's it. My organization, my nonprofit, creates an email inbox for our neighborhood. Now we obviously put it on the web. We feed it into Facebook pages. We also feed it into Twitter. But the idea is that we say this geography now has a public space where we can talk about issues in our community and exchange questions and answers and the like. It's not really all that different than a Facebook page could be for a community or a Facebook group. I know I heard in Tallinn last night that there's a neighborhood that has a very active Facebook group. I understand there's also another district in Tallinn that has a very active email list. And so these aren't radical things that don't exist elsewhere, but they're often completely below the radar. And part of it is that the spaces are used differently in different areas. We have a strong democracy mission, and so we try to bring that along. So what do you use these spaces for? Sharing information, events, and ideas, discussing local issues, working to gather diverse people in a very open place, and hopefully promoting taking action. When people talk, can they move it to action? So our key concept is that you have this space, and what actually really matters about these spaces, no matter what technology you use, is who signs up, right? So having a local elected official on your neighborhood space, having a community reporter from the local newspaper, having candidates, local businesses, schools, the parks, neighborhood leaders, the police, and Neighbor 500. This is what matters. No matter the technology, is can you create a space that connects lots of different people, including immigrants, including other members of your community, and really create that space in an open way. This is what our website will look like. Very simple, topics and discussions. Nothing too radical. The key for us is we can't compete on features. We can't compete with Facebook, so we must compete with simplicity. The only thing you need to know how to do on our space for the lowest technology is how to push reply in your email. It's the only skill. If you can push reply, you can publish. You don't need to know anything else. I won't go into this list, but I'm going to talk about horizontal versus vertical. So essentially, there's a lot of things that happen in horizontal spaces online. And a lot of the projects and apps and different tools that you hear about are more vertical. So these stories that I'm going to tell you are horizontal, but a lot of the future apps are vertical, and I'll explain more about that. But these are all the positive things, and you can look up this online, that people have told me can come from these spaces, and I've seen this happen from crime prevention to disaster response to rural community building. I've seen this happen in these kinds of spaces. This is my team from last year that did summer outreach. They spoke 8 different languages, and we're going to finish up my presentation with a little case study on new voices online. So here's the frame. They're, like I said, horizontal. My view is that my experience over the last 5 years in my neighborhood is a demand function. It tells me every day, what do people actually want? What do people actually want in their community with engagement? And it tells us what people are doing. And vertical are projects or apps where maybe there's an opportunity to create a specialty app, and I have lots of examples coming, where maybe you could scale it because you help people find lost pets, or you help people have feedback into Parliament, or you figure out how to sort of create a niche. And it's not that it's one or the other, but it's appreciating the fact that these can be complementary models. So a key thing after 20 years in this space is, what's the demand? What do people actually say they want? But then, caution, what do they actually do? What do they actually do? And what do governments want to do? And what can they actually do well? Right? These are questions to ask yourself as you explore any use of technology for engagement. And another important question is, what will people actually just do on their own? What kinds of things will happen in the community? Or what kinds of things can government, civil society, the media, others encourage in your local municipalities to happen online, sort of, you call it in the marketplace or in civil society or in government, but what can you encourage, in particular outside of government, that will make your community a stronger, more vibrant, open, communicative place? And so I think it's really important to note that there are things that you will want in your community, or things that are emerging in your community that you'll want to embrace as a municipality, different than what you might host on your own website or with your own technology. So again, Neighbors Online, in my view, presents a real demand function and a dose of reality for local up democracy. So this is where I said I had too many slides. These are the 10 things that I've seen emerge out of these types of online spaces. For some of these, I'm going to go very quickly, just to give you a little flavor. Others, I'll dig in a little more in depth. So number one is helping. Online spaces unleash the capacity of neighbors to help each other. There's an inherent capacity of people to be good, right? And so in this case, the chef at the local restaurant has cancer. People use the forum to promote a fundraiser for the chef. The business actually used the forum to get a lot of feedback from the community, and when they had extra black dirt left over from their gardens, they shared it with the community via the forum. We find a lot of lost pets on our forums. Thank goodness for all the cats that get lost. Thank goodness. They are our #1 recruitment tool. And they mostly always come back, except for we have conversations about the coyotes and the eagles, and sometimes we'll note a conversation about coyotes and then a conversation about missing cats at the same time. We just have no proof, but we have a hunch there's a pattern there. One of my most inspiring stories was on the neighborhood to the north of mine. A woman told the story. She said she went to the local YWCA, it's a gymnasium, and said that she was talking to their neighbor, a little girl who was 7 years old, and they were an immigrant family from Mexico. And the little girl said, we were robbed, and this is just before Christmas, and just before her birthday. And the little girl and the mother confirmed it, yes, they stole our money and all of our presents. And the little girl looked up at her and said, could you make me a birthday card? Just ask for a card. So this inspired the woman to go to her community space online and say, you know what, this happened, I would like to do something for this family. Within about 3 days, there were $150 donated, 2 bags of gifts, 2 hours of face painting for her birthday party, and they were able to share a cake then with her with a few neighbors that came for her birthday. But it was just an example of where this neighborhood had a place where she doesn't know everybody in her neighborhood, but where she could within minutes talk to about 300 people in that neighborhood and have dozens of people say, you know, maybe I'll help out. And I think that's it's inspiring to me. And so unleashing that capacity matters. Sharing, this is a screenshot from a different website called Neighbor Goods, which is in LA, started in Los Angeles, oriented toward helping you just share your tools. We see that happening a lot where people will say things like, hey, does anyone have this kind of a shovel or this kind of weird computer cable, you know? And the public interest is that we're reducing the waste stream, right? The more people share, the less you have to put into your landfill, right? Or less you have to burn, put in the air. So there's lots of other sort of verticals around this. There's a free cycle. I know there's a Thailand free cycle and a Tartu, if I say it right. There's a free cycle there. Craigslist, if that's active here, lots of people give away things there. And then there's new emerging sites that do car sharing. There's a site called couch surfing. But in general, there's different ways that people are connecting. This is hugely popular. People love free stuff. People love free stuff. And so I consider sharing and giving, call it a loss leader. A lost leader. By providing this, people will join. And our civic engagement then reaches far more people. So in my neighborhood, we now reach 30% of households. If we took away all the free stuff and put it in a separate place and then had politics over here, basically you'd have 1% will show up to a space that just says, this is politics only. This is community, which includes politics. That's the #1 lesson. People ask questions all the time when we have our first snow emergency. A lot of new residents will get their car towed because they didn't pay attention to all the rules, or the phone calls, or the signs. They're lining up to get their cars out of impound. And then typically someone will post on the forum, well, that, too bad. You just, so people get very upset, but then the community responds. Basically, instead of the government having to respond, the community responds and says, yeah, you got to move your car, and because you didn't move your car, now there's a big divot, in the road, and it's frozen. Now it's going to be there for the next 3 weeks before we get above freezing again. Neighborhood clubs, just last week, someone new to the neighborhood, and new residents really love these spaces. They search them. Sometimes we have people who have moved to our neighborhood because of the forum, actually. It gave them a sense this is a friendly place to live. Someone said, are there clubs? And someone responded that the library, a government entity, provides all these different book clubs. Here's the list. Here's the website where that information is. Just because you can search something doesn't mean people know how or where to search for it, and so relying on other neighbors is helpful. One key open government connection is Yelp. Yelp is a website, I don't know if it's active here, but it's a place where people tend to rate restaurants and make recommendations on local services. They have a tool now where if a government puts their health records for restaurants, health inspections, in a certain format, they will upload it and automatically connect it to all the different places. So you can look at the public rating and then see what the government has to say about that. So it's an example of where that idea connects with open data in government. I am very interested in, are there ways that we can have public questions that go to government, feed into more e-government self-help, if you will. 311 is kind of the information line system, and I find there's this disconnect between what the operators do on the telephone and what actually is presented on the web. So I think that's an opportunity to convert citizen engagement at a service level into better self-service. So now we're getting more deeply into what tends to be the role of municipalities and government. So informing and outreach. So here's the key thing, and I probably have this in another slide as well. When you get local enough, there's a politician or two who can say, those are my voters. Those are my voters. They can do constituent service, like an online, like a community meeting right there. And it's not just on their shoulders as their page, but it's a place that they can go into when they need to, right? It's also then an independent space where people who maybe do have a criticism or a complaint, they could actually raise it in a place where there's a little bit more accountability. On the other hand, also they can be held accountable by other residents. So in my Sandy Colvin Roy, the outgoing council member who did not run for re-election, would share regular updates, post probably once a week to our forum, or her staff person. We have 13 city council members in Minneapolis, which is the largest city council, so we have a very different scale. She is also a paid position, so it's a different piece in terms of how it's set up. But updates about road work, light rail, construction, meetings, and the key thing is this: timely information. Now this is human mediated, but she can reach people in a very timely way. She does a newsletter, email newsletter once every 2 weeks, but she knows within minutes by posting to the 4 forums that are within her district, she can reach about 3,000 people who happen to each know another 10,000 people, right? So it's really effective. Now, on the vertical side, some different projects that are emerging in the United States. One is a commercial tool called Granicus, which basically provides webcasting services basically to make your meetings available in real time and documents. Gov Delivery, which is actually based in St. Paul in the Twin Cities, they are one of the world's largest email newsletter, email update systems for governments. They deliver email alerts for the UK Parliament, for example. Local calendars are completely below the radar, but my mom was born in a town of 1,500. My dad was born in a township with 100 people, right? And then I grew up in a town of 25,000, and now I live in this big metropolitan area. But I understand in small communities from my own experience that the person who's elected official maybe works for the tourist board, works for the schools. People really blend their roles and responsibilities. And one of the most important things that you see in a small town, whether it be by the local newspaper or by the local tourist authority, is that community calendar. And there's some interesting examples called Elm City and other efforts using Google Calendar to try to get different organizations to use standardized calendar tools so you can aggregate it into a broad community calendar. I think it's very strategic, below the radar, but I'm very interested in how to, if you can get 20 organizations in your community to basically let their calendars talk to each other so their public events can then be shown on a community-wide calendar. Very strategic, and that's where then the government meetings should be listed. If you want more awareness about public meetings, having them in the community calendar rather than just isolated on your own website, where you should have them as well, that's just, I think it makes sense. Back to my speech that I gave here in 2006 or whatever year it was, again and again, it's timely, personalized notification. That doesn't change what's public or private, just getting it to people when they can actually act on it. That is the most democratizing thing that I've seen with open government, with e-government. It's that timely access. Because if you know about it, you can act on it. And that might be picking up the phone. That might be knocking on the door. That might be communicating or going to a meeting. The other thing is, I think, is a trend. There are questions about what should government host directly and what are services that government should use. So granted, in the United States, we're seeing governments subscribe to basically commercial services. That, whether that's good or bad, I can't tell you. But what I can tell you is that often you try to figure out what is most cost effective. And what I've noticed in Estonia and in Finland is that there are a number of national services available to local governments, sort of in a syndicated way. That's fairly unique, I believe. I want to find more examples, and I would say the more you can collaborate on your back-end costs, the better. The other thing I'll mention is that I see a representative deficit in that in most local governments in the United States, it's a unitary system, right? So it's not like a legislature or a state legislature where they have their own IT department and they have, their own structures. If you're a city council member, a elected position, you don't have an IT staff. And so most of the web assets and the tools are invested in sort of services. But as representatives, you're democracy, right? So they gave you microphones in meetings, right? They have lights when you have meetings. What is the web equivalent of that microphone? What's that basic tool set that every elected official should have in Estonia because they're an elected official to communicate and connect with their constituents? Number one, in my view, is the simple email newsletter, a way for people to sign up to get updates in governance, not campaign, but in governance. And the Minneapolis City Council and the Minnesota Legislature does that. And that's, I think, really important. I'm not going to talk in detail about this, but this is from the EPA federally. So what's happened in the last number of years is that basically we went from having, doing a website to suddenly having, 20 different channels. And the reality is there's only so many resources, and you have to prioritize the tools you use to reach people. So good luck. So another area of strong interest is safety and recovery. People want to know, am I safer this week am I less safe this week than I was last week, right? We're willing to tolerate sort of how we are, often based on our ignorance about crime. So the problem with online spaces is that people go from knowing about burglaries, in particular, from maybe 2 or 3 households, maybe down the street when one happens, to now knowing over hundreds of square blocks. So people's sense of security or safety can actually decline the more connected they are to their neighbors because they just find out about a lot more stuff. So this is where we say, and we intervene at times, and we say, the statistics from the local police say crime is actually down. Or yes, you're right, crime has spiked this month. The average over the year might be the same, but this is a spike. And that's what's really important about that is it allows people to sort of say, let's be more vigilant. And what often happens is someone new moves into the neighborhood. They have a certain hobby, which is breaking into homes. And more often than not, the people who are breaking into your houses live within a mile, right, or a kilometer. It's often not far outsiders. This picture of this truck, this is on our forum. The picture was not, but the discussion was. But this truck shot 12 bullets into a neighboring house across the alley. My friend, who's on our forum, his security camera got those. Now, our neighborhood normally does not have shots fired into people's homes. I honestly think it's a mistaken address, but regardless, people are like, what the heck is going on? Seattle is a model government. This is actually near real-time 911 calls. So I don't know what your emergency number is, but they code them and put them on a map in near real time. Some other governments will have data sets with crime. Minneapolis and St. Paul are 2 of the worst cities to try and get crime data from. My view is that if they did a better job, we'd be complaining less about it. I have one story. There was actually a murder on the street near my house. These are 2 people from outside the community that agreed to meet there, and a transaction went bad. Freaky, right? It's just the lights are flashing, go out there. You see the mother running, trying to get past the police line. It's that classical scene. You better believe we had an online dialogue and discussion about this. We wanted to know what was going on. Is there a trend? And we had then community meetings about it as well, all interfacing with the online space. Real stuff. So another area with recovery. So when Hurricane Sandy hit, I was monitoring what were people doing that were affected by this. And so there were dozens and there were actually hundreds and hundreds of Facebook pages, Facebook groups. But what really stuck was about a half dozen local spaces created for this part of this beach or this neighborhood in New Jersey or this. Actually, there was a previous hurricane in Connecticut that hit where they kept their group going. I think that it's really important. People, I have another slide here. People will like a Facebook page because they feel sorry for you, right? They want it, it's like a lapel pin. People create groups to do something. Whether it be an email list or a Facebook group, they create groups. So you can actually look at those spaces. I think it's very important to think about what benefit would your community have before the crisis if you had a local space. So we see our spaces that are generic used, because one of the problems, if the spaces are created only after a disaster, after a flood might be one of your, a disaster that might happen here, for example, or a large forest fire. If the space is only created for the disaster, then when the disaster's over, then all the connections that you created, you kind of lose them. So I like to have those spaces ahead of time. So influencing, this is airport noise. So we had a situation where in my neighborhood, I live near the airport, but the planes basically took off that way, not this way. And then they had a near miss. And after 20 years of everything basically going this way, where planes could take off this way and that way, they decided that, oh, that's a mistake, so they all had to take off this way instead. Well, we had a tremendous spike in noise in our community. We were part in an area where we do not have the extra insulation and air conditioning and various things they've done. It's this urban airport. So our airport, like yours, being very close to the city, it's right in the city in Minneapolis as well. And so hundreds of people turned out to various airport commission meetings. Hundreds of people signed petitions, got the member of Congress involved, got our governor, well, actually a Metropolitan Airports Commission, our local officials, and they're directly reporting to us. So it's our local officials basically responding to our dialogue and saying, here's what I'm doing, but here's a dose of reality. So like the FAA, the Federal Airports Commission, they have this kind of power. But it's an example of neighborhood, state, Congress, federal agencies, all from that little window of basically 4 or 5 of our neighborhood forums covered by this increase in noise. There are emerging projects, I call them online town halls, and this gets into that sort of e-consultation space where government will say, we want input on this draft report, this draft policy. And so that's the vertical, right, is creating those spaces. ICI France has had a community survey platform where they ask people questions on a regular basis. I have wondered why this has not spread across the world. It's a great idea, right? You know, people volunteer to be part of a panel, and the government decides these are the questions of the month we want to ask you. What that says to me is that governments aren't as interested in asking questions as we might hope. And I think it's really important to sort of say, well, if you can ask questions in a way, what questions would you ask that you want input on? And make it regular. So ICI France is a model, and maybe there are other examples, but I ran out of space on the slide, but it says learn from PIN. This is from the media. There's a thing called the Public Insight Network where they have thousands of people who have signed up to be sources for news. And then the journalists will say, we have a story idea, and they'll, based on your profile, will ask questions. We're looking for someone who's involved with this or that. And so that is a really, really helpful tool. So in terms of opportunities, so I like to see PIN used in government, basically. That concept, I think, has a lot of power. And then the key thing for us is that if things happen online, if they show up in the local newspaper. So we were talking about the local newspaper this morning, briefly. You know, getting things in print, that may be your broad access. You know, online it gets you so far, and then it's actually getting into news, which matters. One of the problems so far with online participation is, I call them the digital squeakers. And they could say the squeaky wheel gets the grease is sort of the saying, right? So the people who tend to show up already offline are the ones who are showing up online. And what good is it if we basically just have the same people showing up who showed up before? We actually really want broader access, and we want more skills of e-citizenship. So engaging. This is where you have more of a two-way connection with government on our spaces. And neighborhood councils get government funding in Minneapolis and St. Paul. In Hamlin Midway, it's over in St. Paul, they basically ask a simple question. Our business development committee is looking for ideas about new businesses that you would like to have us try to attract to our community. 26 Discuss posts later, we have a big long list of different types of businesses communities members are interested in. It's one of many ways they can get feedback, but it's a very low-cost way. And it helps that we had, I think, like 700 people already in a virtual room where they could access them at no cost, essentially. Light rail signals, I mentioned that before. That's actually the photo of the two council members next to the new switching gear, so the stoplights actually work. We have a light rail that runs along the road and it stops traffic, and it's been a mess. You would spend 7 to 10 minutes sometimes trying to cross the street because of the way it was designed. New advanced equipment, this is a 10-year-old light rail line, has taken, honestly, dozens of minutes off of, or minutes off of your drive in the area. One project I'll mention quickly is the Google Civic Info API. They're gathering more and more information about elected officials. So they started with voting information, and now they're trying to help you look up who represents you. I think a fundamental challenge is that a lot of democratic information about who represents you, where their districts are, that's often not in a good data set. And it's often not standardized. But a lot of the tools that people will use to look up who represents me are national, even global tools. So how do we better organize our information about who represents us and get it into these global tools? So Google is pushing that along. We're also seeing issues where, I call them digital natives, but there are new elected officials in Minneapolis and other places that really love Facebook. They love Facebook, and it seems more democratic. And the challenge often is that it isn't as democratic as you might think, because if they're your friends or the people who support you most and know that exchange is happening, a low-income resident, an immigrant, a young student, they're not going to know the most effective way to interact with my local politician is to friend them on Facebook. They're not going to know that. So either we need links to their Facebook pages, or we need additional ways that they can interact. Deliberating, very important. We have a blog post about a racially connected violent attack. It's a minority-majority neighborhood in St. Paul. Huge dialogue. I mean, a mother of 5 black boys said every time we leave our home, we feel like we're suspects. Another person's a white conservative woman saying, I need my gun to feel safe. Very intensive dialogue during a time of crisis, of rising violence in the summer, and to have that space to actually have that exchange. And then connect it with in-person community meetings. We had an in-person meeting tied to our forum in advance of a broader city meeting. People also commented to us that they asked the question, why was our forum so much more substantial than the media websites where people were talking about race war and different types of things? And my response was, it's because it's their neighborhood, it's their community. And we use real names, by the way, I should mention that. We've been using real names since 1994, cornerstone of accountability in our system. Funding and spending, I look at taxes as sort of the ultimate crowdfunding opportunity. I just learned last night that Tartu is having some participatory budgeting happening. And here's the key thing is that while there's crowdfunding where basically nonprofits and others are beginning to say, hey, you can donate to different projects online, I'm very interested in how people can have greater transparency around how government is spending their money, but also begin experimenting with ways to reach out. We had an effort with ski trails that won a neighborhood $1,000, but this is from our local council, and they had discussions online on our space, and they had to vote in person at the annual town hall meeting. So last piece here, starting and solving. What good is it if we just talk? How about some action? We created an online a new community garden in my neighborhood. There, my son and my daughter are on the right-hand side there, and so I call it adhocracy. But I'm very interested in how can we engage people to solve problems. And then how can we also bring those tools into government task forces, into neighborhood associations? I know some of you here are involved with creating neighborhood associations in Tallinn. I'm very bullish about how you could experiment at that level. Sometimes because the laws aren't as stringent, right? So one of the issues in the US is government officials will say, well, I can't talk to you online in public because it's like a public meeting. And so they basically use the open meeting laws as an excuse to be less transparent. It's very odd, but it's something that the concern is that there'll be private communication by a majority of council members, exclusive of the public, and they'll be making decisions in private against our laws. And my view is if you have public online spaces, of course you should be able to have a majority there, as long as they're public and well linked. couple of trends, I'm just going to skim over this. These are big things that matter. I'm very interested in how we have local open government. You mentioned principles earlier. So how do we create that network of national efforts to promote open government, but also then to take it more local? And so there's an effort called Code for America and others, where there are efforts of local coders, software developers, designers, open government advocates. And you see on the map here these little dots. And so I'm very interested in ways that we work nationally, internationally to promote local up exchange. And this is where you begin building local apps, having a demand for local data, and or the kind of groups that might create these online neighborhood spaces. You can look up the principles on the website. There's a report that has all these fancy words. They had 100 people working on this for a year. And I worked on mine, I was one person for a week. But if you want pretty graphics and nice little videos, this actual report is very interesting. This is much broader than my discussion, but look up Now and Next. And I think there's it tells you more about what's happening in the broader sense of how people are using the net and basically in society, and how that might impact, in your view, maybe government around you. So the last thing I want to mention is that the problem thus far with the net and democracy is that the people who are showing up already are showing up online, and we have a huge gap in terms of connections. We also have an issue with the lower income and minorities and others. We have an issue where essentially people who talk online, they're fewer than those who talk offline, but there's a greater polarization. The folks on the right and the left talk every day, much more so than the moderates. And so one of the challenges online is that if you basically have spaces where it's more vitriolic or more partisan, if you don't have that more friendly community spirit, you end up with spaces that essentially just have those that have, they call it the largest axe to grind. And it turns off most everyday folks. And so figuring out ways to bring out more voices. This report, I highly recommend it. I won't go into details there. So what I'm focusing on internationally and nationally is trying to create a movement around new voices. Taking these lessons from Minnesota, taking these lessons from other communities. This is a case where essentially what happens when those who show up are the ones who always speak. In this case, whites, 38% of them communicate by contacting elected officials online, signing petitions, and you have a smaller percentage, but also a smaller population. So what gets heard? If you're in government, who's being heard? And so I think it's really important to caution ourselves about the voices not being heard and to try to raise other voices. There's a case study you can go look at on your own time. I'll just say this, that our goal is to recruit 10,000 people in St. Paul, and we've never done this before. The last 3 years, we basically have taken our model from Minneapolis and have tried to basically proactively create it. We use census data. The dots you can't see from there, the different colors, but basically it's about half people of color, 17% foreign born, and basically our view, you can't, over here it's basically where mostly white folks live, right? And the challenge is that we want to have spaces based on these different district councils that aren't just homeowners, aren't just one race. And so we're very proactive. This is a different neighborhood, but this is a Somali community. We have 30,000 that live in all of Minneapolis and St. Paul, East African, Oromo, and then we have, like I said, you can't see the pale dots here, Native American, Latino. So these are, our neighborhoods are very diverse, and so the question is, can we build connections across race, across ethnicity? And it's easier said than done, but we're working to do it. The key thing is this: we use census data to map out. We went door to door. We hired people who spoke these different languages and worked in the community. This is a part of our team from this year. And so we have a lot of experience. We're going to be packaging up these lessons to share them. But ultimately, my goal is not just to have local community spaces where people can engage their government, engage each other, that for those who just show up, but have them for all people. And a couple more pictures here from the Somali Independence Day. We have this crazy idea. We sign people up on paper. So by using open source independent technology, as long as I get your email address and your first name, last name, I can just put you on. Right? And then if you know how to push reply, then you can publish. So like I said, lowest common denominator. On the other hand, there are folks who just want Facebook. We do feed things into Facebook, but we do see some challenges there in the future. That's the electronic town hall made from computer equipment. And we had a baseball team who volunteered they're from Laos, the children, their parents were. They live in public housing who help go door to door. and did lots of outreach, grew our forums, and what's next to finish off is that we want to go from having people in the room to actually having greater engagement. So every one of our forums has a volunteer facilitator. So anyone who creates a Facebook page or an email list, there's someone kind of in charge. We think that's really important. And to basically deal with issues when two people get upset with each other, very important. The slides are there, and we have one last conclusion. In this whole space, I think it's really important to ask yourself, as a citizen, does this actually make my life as a citizen better? Does it make my life better, what we're doing here with our use of technology and governance? And then ask yourself that second question. Is it special to people most like me, or is it actually something that benefits all people? So you want it to be relevant to you, but you also want to caution yourself. But that's my view, is that with democratic intent, we can bring far more voices into this space. So that's it. I know we're out of time for questions pretty much here, but we'll see what we can do. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, what we do, because you are going to go
Yep.
around everywhere.
Great.
So we'll have the questions from the audience. You can have direct interaction. We
Perfect.
don't want
Yep.
to cut off the interaction. However, if there is somebody asking who wants to ask, kas keegi tahab küsida sellise küsimuse, mis oleks nagu huvitav kindlasti kõigile teada vastust? Anybody? Estonians usually don't ask questions, but
It'll be all over coffee, won't it? We'll be over out here and have a good chat. That's
okay,
good.
we'll have a very democratic chat. You know,
Yeah.
we have this problem here that there is a big distrust. I mean, those higher ups distrust the lower ones and the other way around. Like you have the polarization in politics that Democrats don't think that Republicans are doing anything right, or the other way around. Okay.
Yep.
So that is. Obama still the sort of, is he American citizen or not? We don't know, right?
So, well, if I can make one comment on that, I was joking that I used to talk about how we want government to listen to the people, and I've realized that's been misunderstood with the recent revelations about National Security Agency, that we want you to engage the people, not necessarily just listen to us. The other thing I'll say is that if you want to see technology not working in democracy, look at the United States Congress. I mean, look at how difficult it is for our members of our elected officials to do anything other than the strong party line, if you will, right? And so technology is a total accelerant of those loudest voices. That's why local communities have hope, right? Because people actually on the right and left, they'll actually get together, they'll work together because it's their community. And typically there's not a right wing or a left wing way to fill a pothole.
Right. Okay, and thank you very much again. And now I would like, yeah. Liada,
I have
there
question.
is one question
Yeah.
from the mother of our democracy, so we have to do it.
Please, maybe you have microphone and this
Yeah.
headset. I will ask in Estonian. Minu küsimus on vihakõne kohta, et meil on Eestis ka päris mitmeid selliseid online keskkondi, kus me saame arvamust avaldada, aga tihtipeale juhtub see, et inimesed tulevad sinna pahas tujus ja ütlevad midagi halba teiste kohta. Et kuidas te seda olete oma selles online keskkonnas välistanud? Aitäh.
So, yes, so we have rules and guidelines. We moderate all new users until we verify that they're not a spammer. And real names deals with about 85% of the problems, in my view, or 80% of the problems that would come from being anonymous and sort of not being accountable to your racist speech. People who have real names tend not to share those opinions as much. Our facilitation it takes care of the next 15%, and then we have a 5% error rate. And what I mean is that it's not perfect, but what happens is that if people violate our civility terms, which basically our rules simply say no name calling. Pretty simple, no name calling. And that typically, it goes beyond just hate speech, but to like basically calling someone else a name, you idiot, you know, or calling classes of people's names, those stupid politicians. It actually in theory, violates our terms. And now what we don't do, though, is you can say what you wanted to say, and then we give you a warning. You get 2 warnings in a year, you're suspended for 2 weeks. You get 3 warnings in a year, you're suspended for 6 months. And so it's this balancing act. We hardly ever have warnings, but essentially we let you be an adult, but if you go beyond, you can be suspended. But we have had times where we've had to have some direct suspensions, not so much around hate speech, but when we get to the neighborhood level, sometimes there are neighbors who really hate each other, and they have a dispute over a fence. And we basically have another rule that says no one-on-one arguments. Nothing will destroy your space more than having a conflict between 2 individuals, which has really no public sort of quality to it, being allowed to fester on a space. Because once the audience begins to leave, then the commons is dead. But it's a balancing act.
Thank you very much. We are trying to do our balancing act. We are inviting now, kas tohiks kutsuda siia härra Rait Maruste. Meil on olnud ka ju probleeme samamoodi, et ei saa aru, et ühed arvavad, et teised on pahad ja teised arvavad, et need esimesed on pahad. Ja selleks, et arusaamist suurendada, selleks peaks nagu kohe algusest peale omavahel rääkima ja meie tahame siin praegu nüüd omavalitsuse tasandil sellist e-demokraatiat arendada. Võib-olla härra Riigikogu põhiseaduskomisjoni esimees ütleb paar sõna, mida tema sellest arvab.
Aitäh! Austatud kohalolijad, kõigepealt vaatamata sellele, et ma olen täna hommikul üleval 4:30 ja tulin siia lennukil nii kohe kiiresti kui sain, jäin ma hiljaks ja sellepärast ma vabandan teie ees. See, mida täna arutate, on kindlasti väga oluline ja ilmselt me oleme riigi valitsemises, sealhulgas siis kohaliku omavalitsuse valitsemises sellises tehnoloogilises murdepunktis. Ja me täpselt ei tea, see, mis oli vanasti, ennem, see kestis pikka aega ja see uus on tulnud väga kiiresti peale. Ja seetõttu me veel ei tea kõike, mida see uus kõik on kaasa toomas meile. Ja et me selle üle siis arutaksime, on väga tervitatav. Kindlasti on see online süsteem, mille tehnoloogia on meile võimaldanud, toonud kaasa inimeste panema informeerituse ja ka võimu teostajad saavad paremini teada, mida inimesed mõtlevad. Samal ajal peaks mõtlema ka selle peale, kas see uus areng kohtleb kõiki võrdselt selle koha pealt, et kas seal on inimesi, tekivad suuremad lõhed nende inimeste vahel, kes kasutavad seda uut tehnoloogiat ja nende vahel, kes ei kasuta, kes on kas siis puudega inimesed, lapsed, vanurid või on oma töö olemuse tõttu eemal arvutiekraanist ja ei näpi seda kogu aeg, et olla siis online kogu aeg ühendatud ja väljendada oma arvamust või võtta seisukohta. Kuni siis selleni välja, et peame mõtlema ka selle peale, kas meie sellest tehnoloogiast ei jää lõpmatusele sõltuvaks või väga rippuvaks. Mis juhtub siis, kui näiteks elekter ära võetakse? Mis siis saab? Kas me ühiskond on võimeline hakkama saada ka siis, kui on blackout? Täielik. Ühesõnaga, me oleme sellises uues harjumatus veel olukorras, kindlasti see sisaldab uusi võimalusi ja ma soovin teile siis igakülgset edu, et neid uusi võimalusi läbi arutada, leida uusi rahuldavaid võimalusi mõlemale poolele, sest ega lõppkokkuvõttes on ju ühine huvi ja hool, et riigi valitsemine saaks tehtud võimalikult mõistlikult ja kõikide huvi arvestaval viisil. Ja suur tänu teile ja kõik edu!
Nii, ja suur aitäh selle tervituse eest ja nüüd ma annaksin sõna Mart Sogelale, kes hakkab siis Eesti kogemusi. Tähendab, Eestis meil on tegelikult hästi palju seda. Nii et väga mõistlik siin, kui te vaatasite Steveni slaididel, oli ka viide veel meie Tommile kunagi selleks, et see on nagu emerging trend, et ta on meil juba nagu peaaegu surnud. Aga emerging tähendab selliseid tulevaid asju on meil väga palju ja loodame, et neid asju tuleb veel ja veel. Ja siis võib-olla sa hakkad siis nendest järjest rääkima või tutvustama neid, kes seda teevad, et ma arvan, et see on nagu väga hea.
Aitäh! Eesti on oma e-lahenduste, oma e-demokraatia lahenduste poolest maailmas hästi tuntud ja samas on tegelikult päris selge, et sellist e-demokraatia õpikut on veel vara kirjutama hakata, sellepärast et tehnoloogia muutub iga 2 aasta tagant. Niisugust legendi räägitakse, et siis kui Edison oli leiutanud lambipirni juba 2-3 aastat ja ta oli ise juba väga hädas sellega, ta oli muudkui leiutanud ja ta ei leidnud seda, ta oli teinud umbes 4000 katsetust ja no, ei tule kusagil seda lambipirni. Ja siis ta sõber ütles talle, et Toomas, ole hea mees, lõpeta ära, sa rikud oma elu ära sellega. Ja siis Edison ütles, et küll aga vaata asja positiivset poolt. Ma tean vähemalt 4000 viisi, kuidas lambipirni ei tööta. Ja samamoodi on Eestis, ma olen kindel, et on tehtud vähemalt 4000 katsetust, kuidas inimesi kaasata. Ja võib öelda, et me teame vähemalt 3600 moodust, kuidas see ei tööta, aga me teame ka 400 moodust, kuidas see töötab. Ja täna on siia kutsutud sellised huvitavamad lahendused, on kutsutud siia üles näitama. Esimesena räägib Teele Pehk linnalaborist, räägib linna ideest. Ja linna idee on siis fondi rahastatud projekt, mis tegeleb sellega, kuidas linna kogukonnad saaksid linnaga paremini suhelda. Ja nemad on kaasanud kõik aktiivsemad Tallinna asumiseltsid ja loonud koos sellise koostöö hea tava.
Nii, sinu oma oli see
Tere ka minu poolt. Ma panen selle suureks kõigepealt. Jah, ma toon teid Tallinna ja toon teid sellest võib-olla e-kaasamise dimensioonist välja, sellepärast et tänase seminari teema on avatud valitsemine, mitte ainult e-kaasamine. Kuigi eks need asjad on omavahel seotud, mina nimetan seda juba virreaalsuseks, et on reaalsus ja on see internetimaailm, see Facebooki ja meililistide ja kõige maailm, aga ta on nii omavahel seotud. Ja ma räägin sellest, mida siis Tallinnas naabruskonnad teevad. Ja Stevenile võib see tulla üllatuseks, aga ei ole ainult üks naabruskond, kes aktiivselt suhtleb Facebookis ja ei ole teine naabruskond, kes aktiivselt suhtleb oma listi kaudu, neid on koguni 22 Tallinnas. Et see on see meie praegune reaalsus, eks kõik ei ole nii aktiivsed, kõik ei ole nagu samal skaalal, aga siin on näha, kuidas need siis paiknevad. Ja etteruttavalt ma ütlen selle virreaalsuse kohta ära, et need järgmised lahendused, need on jah sellised e-lahendused, mida te kuulete, ja linna ideel või siis nendel aktiivsetel naabruskondadel on hea meel, nagu nad on väga põimitud omavahel, et meie Tallinn sellise uudiseid koondava platvormina siis võimendab seda, mida asumiseltsid teevad. Community tools, väga paljud naabruskonnad kasutavad seda oma kodulehe põhjana ja ka linnaidee koduleht on selle peale üles ehitatud. Kodupildiga otseselt seoseid ei ole, aga Hille Hinsbergiga on väga head suhted, tema on aidanud meid selle linnaidee algatuse nõustamisel ja suunata seda õigele teele. Aga nüüd siis, mul pole ainult 15 minutit rääkida, seega natukene siis nendest aktiivsetest naabruskondadest Tallinnas, et mis juba toimub. Kindlasti te teate, aga hästi paar slaidi lihtsalt selle kohta, mõned näited, et mida nad siis teevad. Et hästi populaarne on korraldada selliseid tänavafestivale oma asumi päevi, siin on näide Nõmmelt. Neid toimub igal pool Uues Maailmas, Kalamajas, Maarjamäel, Pirital, aina rohkem ja rohkem. Ja isegi seal professorite külas Kopli poolsaare tipus. Ja eks selle tegevuse taha saab nagu peale saab igasuguseid silte panna, mida siis selle kaudu tahetakse teha, et see ei ole lihtsalt mingi tänavaruumi elustamine, see on ka hästi palju piirkonna miljöö väärtustamine, selle võib-olla miljöö ümberdefineerimine, üldse koha identiteediga tegelemine. Aga jah, hästi palju see keskendub ikkagi sellisele avalikule ruumile ja sellele, et inimesed tuleksid välja, sellepärast et Eestis on inimesed igal pool sotsiaalmeedias väga aktiivsed ja väga varmad kiruma valitsust, kõike muud. aga et me just tegeleme sellega ja need asumisseltsid ise ka väga palju, et inimesed tuleksid välja, et naabrid tunneksid teineteist, et juletaks tere öelda ja sealt edasi siis juletaks rohkem asju teha ja siin järjekordne näide, selline tänavaruumi algatus, et mis oleks, kui see tänav oleks hoopis teistsugune ja siis väikesed katsetused seal. Ja hästi palju on sellist alternatiivset, mina kutsun seda terve mõistusega lähenemist, et kuidas hoida raha kokku, kuidas võib-olla ruumi palju paremini kasutada, kuidas võib-olla ruumi arendada niimoodi, et see vastaks ka siis kohalike elanike ja miks mitte ka turistide siin juhul soovidele, et mereäär jääks vabaks, et mereäär oleks avalikus kasutuses. Aga nüüd selle linnaide algatuse juurde, et need on kõik ilusad näited ja see tegevus toimib väga palju iseenesest, aga paljudel juhtudel see põrkub ikkagi sellise linnavalitsuse metalluste vastu. Ja sellepärast see linnaide algatus sündiski aasta tagasi nende seltside omavahelisest vajadusest suhtlusest ja linnaide algatus keskendub just nimelt sellele avatud valitsemisele või valitsemiskultuuri parandamisele. Ja eesmärgid said seatud niimoodi, et asumiseltsi kui kohaliku eksperti rohkem tutvustada ja tegelikult ka siis neid endid võimustada selles võtmes. Ja hästi palju linnavalitsusega koostöö parandamisele, ma räägin kogu aeg Tallinnast siin. Ja selle taustal ka sellist avalikkuse teadlikkuse tõstmist ja üldiselt kogukonna liikumise lahti mõtestamist. Et mis me siiamaani oleme saavutanud, et me oleme hästi palju kohtunud, arutanud, defineerinud, kirja pannud, kõik need üles kodulehele pannud, kajastanud asju. Ja väga palju oli see seotud kohalike valimistega, aga mitte ainult selles mõttes. Mida me saavutasime, aga ma ei ütle, et see ainult on linnaide algatuse vili. See, et kohalikel valimistel räägiti erakordselt palju sisulisest kaasamisest, asumiseltsidest kui kohalikest ekspertidest, linnaosa valitsuste tugevdamise vajadusest ja kõigest sellest, mis haakub teemaga. Et seda oli hea näha. Ja siis tõesti, nagu Martti mainis, et me oleme koostanud koostöö hea tava. See on sündinud kogu selle algatuse jooksul 1 aastaga, see, et mingit dokumenti, mingit raamkokkulepet on vaja linnavalitsusega, et see koostöö siis toimiks ja et oleks mingid üldisemad väärtused kirjas. Ja ma näitan et selle koostöö hea tava, ta ei ole mitte midagi uut selles mõttes, ta koondab väga palju neid seadusepügalaid ja neid põhimõtteid, mis on kohalikul omavalitsusel niikuinii erinevate seadustega pandud. Aga võib-olla siis lihtsalt tuletades meelde. Aga ta ei ole ainult sellisele linnavalitsusele nagu näpuga viibutamiseks, ta on tegelikult ka nendele samadele vabaühendustele ja asumiseltsidele selliseks kontrollimehhanismiks, et ka seal nendel on erinevad kohustused ja õigused sisse kirjutatud. Ja siin lihtsalt üks punkt, et jah, see koostöö hea tava on niisugune suht juriidiline tekst, ta lähtub väga palju riiklikust kaasamise heast tavast, aga siis me oleme teda teinud Tallinna keskseks, seltsid ise on panustanud, teised vabaühendused ka. Ta ei ole veel valmis, ta on mustandi faasis, sellepärast et Tallinna linnavalitsuselt pole veel lõplikku heakskiitu tulnud ja siin see trikk ongi, et ega sellest mingit kasu ei ole, kui linnavalitsus seda omaks ei võta ja volikogu seda heaks ei kiida. Aga igatahes töö sellega jätkub ja mis mu mõte on, mitte ainult minu mõte, et kas tegelikult selline koostöö hea tava võiks olla igal vallal ja igal linnal. Et ma arvan, probleeme on igal pool, mitte ainult Tallinnas. On häid suhteid vabaühendustega, aga pahatihti ikkagi, või siis need head suhted on võib-olla ühe osapoole meelest ja teine osapool on hoopis teisel seisukohal, et kas selline raamdokument, sellised nagu raamkokkulepped võiksid olla igal pool, et siis nagu see vestlus, et jah, aga meil ju kõik toimib, tegelikult ei toimi, kõik need vaidlused jääksid ära, et oleks selline parem lähtekoht, et hakkame nüüd selle tänava peale mõtlema või hakkame nüüd seda sotsiaalset teenust välja arendama või mis iganes, et sealt saaks nagu edasi minna palju produktiivsemalt. Minu poolt kõik, aitäh!
Aitäh teile! Kes on niisugused linnainimesed, siis vaadake üle see koostöö hea tava, see on tegelikult päris äge lihtsalt, ja kuna see on nagu juriidiline dokument, see on ka mingi asi, mida saate lihtsalt otse sisse võtta enda kavadesse, et vaadake üle see. Järgmisena räägime meie Tallinnast. Meie Tallinn on siis justkui sotsiaalvõrgustik linnadele, mis ühendab omavahel kohalikud elanikud, kohalikud MTÜ-d, kohalikud ettevõtted ja siis linnavalitsuse. Erinevalt teistest asjadest, millest täna räägitakse, siis tegemist ei ole mitte grandi toel või siis nagu fondi toel tehtud asjaga, vaid tegemist on startupiga, ja mille siis nagu rahastajaks on Londonis asuv Bethnal Green Ventures nimeline kiirendi. Ja selle tee valimine tähendas ka seda, et see on lihtsalt niisugune projekt, millel on mingisugune lõppeesmärk, vaid meie Tallinn pidi välja mõtlema ka viisi, kuidas siis ise raha teenida selle kõige juures. Lõpuks see tee, mida valiti, oli siis hüperlokaalse või kohaliku reklaami näitamine, ja mis tähendas, et see projekt ise ka nagu liikus sellise nagu kohaliku ajakirjanduse poole. Meie Tallinnast räägib meie Tallinna community manager Merilin Mandel.
Tere, mina olen Merilin ja enne kui ma jätkan selle ettekandega, siis ma tahaksin kindlasti natukene rõhuda selle peale, et nagu Martin ütles ka, et tegu on startupiga ning meie nimi võib olla natukene ekslik. Nimelt võidakse arvata, et kuna me oleme meie Tallinn ja meil domeen on tallinn.ee, et siis me kuulume ka nii-öelda siis sinna pikka nimekirja Tallinna linna poolt hallatavatesse nagu veebisaitide hulka, mis ei ole üldse nii. Ning Tallinnaga on meil siis lihtsalt seotud vastastikuse koostöö protokoll, mis sätestab, et meie teenus on siis linnale ja linnaelanikele tasuta ning vastutasuks võime siis näidata ja müüa oma keskkonnas reklaame. Nii et see on siis see, mis meid nii-öelda eristab teistest Tallinna lehtedest. Mis siis see meie Tallinn on? Meie eesmärk on tegelikult edendada kohalikke kogukondi. Me oleme justkui selline virtuaalne teadete tahvel, mis on jaotatud siis veebisaidil asumiteks ja linnaosadeks, mistõttu me proovime nii-öelda edendada suhtlust kõikide kohalike nii-öelda elementide vahel, nagu MTÜ-d, inimesed, omavalitsused ja ärid. Ning üks peamise eesmärk on siis see, et igasugune mikroinformatsioon, mis tavaliselt on asumipõhine, räägime siis kas siis kuulsatest kaotatud leitudest võtmetest näiteks, või siis muud infot, mis on nagu asumi inimestele väga tähtis, et see läheb tavalises sotsiaalvõrgustikus väga nii-öelda laiali, see kaob ära ja rääkimata siis üldse muudest meediumitest, mis on üldse võimalik, kuidas on infot võimalik jagada. Ning meie siis eesmärk ongi seda mikroinformatsiooni kuidagi väga täpselt nii-öelda jätta omasse paika, kus ta jõuab kindlasti kohalikene, kus inimesed saavad seda hästi nagu kätte. Ehk siis lehel on 3 tasandit. On esileht, kus on siis olemas kõikide asumite nii-öelda nagu ühtne voog, mida saab siis valida kas populaarsuse või nii-öelda ajalise järjekorra järgi. Ning vasakus ääres saab siis valida vastavalt sellele, kui geograafiliselt täpselt sa tahad seda infot leida, valida nii linnaosa, ning selle alt edasi valida siis asumi, kui oled tõesti väga huvitatud sellest, mis seal nii-öelda päriselt toimub. Ja kuidas see leht siis nagu toimib või kuidas see sisu sinna tekib, on tegelikult hästi lihtne, et koosneb nii-öelda siis 2 poolest. Kõigepealt on postitused, mida saavad lehele teha siis nii inimesed, organisatsioonid, mida kõike veel, ning teine osa on siis üle 200 automaatse uudisvoo, mida me tõmbame sisse siis nii-öelda Facebookist, kodulehtedelt nii edasi. Et selle alla käivad igasugused kohvikud, kohalikud pagariärid, noortekeskused, teatrid ja nii edasi. Ja mis see annab meile, on see, et kui sa lõpuks siis valid selle ühe asumisel lehel välja või kas või lihtsalt linnaosa, siis sa saad väga asjakohase adekvaatse ülevaate sellest, mis seal tegelikult toimub. Ja kuidas tekib võib-olla küsimus, et kui seda infot on nii palju, mis tuleb igalt poolt, et kuidas seda siis hallata, vastus on lihtne, olen mina, oma tõlkimatu või seni vist mitte tõlgitud ametinimesega community manager, kelle üks tööülesanne on siis kureerida seda, mis seal lehel toimub. Ehk siis mitte, et ma ei kirjuta neid uudiseid ise, vaid see kõik, mis sisse tuleb, et ma teen ta kergemaks suude jaoks, mida nii-öelda mäluda, et ma kas parandan kirjavigasid pealkirjades ja lõpetan siis sellega, et ma panen need vastavalt relevantsusele nii-öelda järjekorda esilehele, kes nagu läheb sinna, saab aru, mis praegult on kõige rohkem praegult toimuv asi, mis seal üldse on. Ja mis on siis kõige huvitavam, selle me viskame üles ka Facebooki, nii et see on selline nagu inforinglus mingis mõttes kuskilt otsast alates. Ja mis see info siis on tegelikult, mis meil nagu liigub? Nagu vist Martin mainis, et meil on nagu sellised, et me proovime ühendada omavahel väga mitmeid nii-öelda siis üksusi, mis saavad nagu kohalikus kontekstis olla. Ma valisin välja 3 näidet, mis võib-olla iseloomustab kõige paremini seda, mis meil toimub. Üks neist on see, kui Nõmme linnaosa küsis oma elanikelt, et kas võiks laiendada Nõmme keskuses jalakäijate ala, ja see sai nagu väga tulist vastukaja loomulikult sellepärast, et inimesed ju elavad seal ja tahavad nagu sõna sekka öelda, milleks siis meie andsime neile võimaluse. Teine on see, mis on nagu see inimesele, kas võiksin pausi palun teha? Ma olen pilti ära viskamas ees, sest et mul on hästi madal rõhk praegu, ma võiksin hetkest hiljem jätkata. Okay.
Ma võin edasi minna.
Võid edasi minna, muidugi väga hea, aitäh sulle.
Aitäh alguse eest. Siis, mis oli teine asi, mis äge just oli üks uue maailma elanik võttis endale initsiatiivi, kui uus raudteetunnel ehitati ja üldse ajas ise kõik asjad korda, et ta võiks nagu ära värvida selle tunneli seina ja teha sinna nagu nii-öelda graffitit. Siis ta andis sellest teada, seda postitust jagati hästi palju ja inimestele kohutavalt meeldis, mis seal nagu tehti. Ehk siis inimesed tulid kohale, et see oli ka esimest kord, mina käisin ka abiks seal, kuna see kuulutus seal oli, ja siis me nii-öelda tegime siis illegaalset asja, me tegime graffitit seina peale ja siis inimesed tulid mööda ja ütlesid, et aitäh teile, et te teete seda, see on nii ilus. Ja see sai niisugust nagu seda nagu jagati hästi palju. Ja siis, mis oli nüüd kõige uuem asumiselts, mis Tallinnas tehti, ehk siis Kassisaba selts, et selle nii-öelda seltsi tegemise infot levitati ka meie kaudu, ehk siis meie nii-öelda üks hea point ongi, et saaks kätte sellised kõige, ongi, et Kassisaba inimesed oleks võimalik meid pidi kätte saada, siis selle uudiseid jagati meie kaudu. Ja kuidas siis see asi raha teenib, on väga kohaliku reklaamiga, ehk siis, et kui sa oled, võtame näiteks, kui sa oled pubi Nõmmel, siis sul ei ole mõtet ennast reklaamida üleriigilises ajalehes. Ega ei ole isegi mõtet reklaamida ülelinnalises ajalehes, vaid sul on ainult Nõmme inimestele seda reklaami vaja näidata. Ja sama võib-olla ka Mustamäe inimestele. Ehk me tegime, lihtsalt võimaldasime inimestel näidata oma reklaami täpselt nagu linnaosade kaupa. Alustasime 2012 mais, et startup inimestele niisugune ütles, et kui sa alustad oma lehega ja see näeb alguses, et kui sul ei ole piinlik sellepärast, kui kole see välja näeb, siis sa alustasid liiga hilja. Ehk ka meie alustasime 2012 mais sellega Nõmmelt ja see nägi selline välja umbes ja me oleme kogu aeg parandanud seda lehte täpselt vastavalt niimoodi, nagu siis selle kasutajad on meid nagu palunud, et me muudaksime seda. 2013 me saime uue kujunduse ja levisime üle Tallinna linna. Ehk siis, et nüüd meil oleme kõikides Tallinna asumites olemas. On väga palju asumeid, kus meie info ei ole väga adekvaatne, sest sealt lihtsalt ei ole mitte ühtegi automaatpostitust ega seal ei ole ühtegi inimest, kes veel postitaks. Aga on asumeid, kus see info on tõesti, et sa saadki teada, mis 3 restoranis päeva praeks on, millal järgmine kontsert on ja mis iganes asi on toimumas, millal teedeehitus ära lõpeb. See tehniline pool on tehtud niimoodi, et seda tegelikult on võimalik laiendada, lihtsalt nagu kopeerida teistesse linnadesse, et meil tegelikult ongi olemas Tallinnas, Tartus, Surrey maakonnas Inglismaal, Camdeni linnaosas Londonis, Vilniuses ja Berliinis need installatsioonid, aga tegelikult see tehniline pool on kõigest esimene takistus. Tegelik asi on see, kuidas need inimesed sinna saada, kuidas need inimesed saada ja kuidas need linnaosad sinna saada, kuidas need kohalikud ärid sinna saada. Ja see on nagu see, mis meil juba Tallinnas napilt tuleb nagu välja, aga praegu me teeme seda Tallinnas ja õpime Tallinnas oma asju. Meie järgmine asi, mis me teeme, on see, et me liigume selles suunas, et me saime nii-öelda Tallinna linn lubas meil kasutada Vabaduse väljaku ekraani, ja siis me liigume sinnapool, kuna meil on kõik need kohalikud uudised olemas ja me otsisime nagu uusi väljundeid neile, siis üks väljund, mis me leidsime, on justkui ekraanid, ja neid ekraane tuleb hästi palju, sest praegu on niisugune ekraani tekkimise aeg, ehk siis me ise natukene liigume sinna suunas, et olla nii-öelda nagu tarkvaratootja digitaalsetele ekraanidele. Ehk see on see, kus see teekond on välja jõudnud praeguseks. Vaadake meid üle meie.tallinn.ee. See on mis kõik. Aitäh, Merilin! Nii, kas Henri Laupmaa on siin? Okei. Siin on Martin. Martin raputab pead, Martin ei taha kommentituusist rääkida. Kuidas? Ei taha? Võime teha lihtsalt nagu kiire ülemineku, sest millega tegemist on, ehk siis kommentituus sai 2010 aastal alguse Shanghai Expo jaoks, kus otsiti nagu see oli Shanghai Expo teema ja Community Tools arendas välja oma sellise tarkvaraplatvormi, mis on natukene nagu WordPress asumiseltsile või Drupal asumiseltsile, kui sa oled itimees. Ehk siis sa saad teha justkui oma asumiseltsi või oma linnaosa kõige paremini elanikega suhtlemise platvormi. Et see sai alguse Uue Maailma Seltsi kodulehest, see algas sellest, et seal oli meililist, kus oli 1500 inimest, mis oli ammu liiga palju ühe meililisti jaoks ja siis sealt see kuidagi asi niimoodi arenes. Community Tools tegi koostööd Viljandi ja Vigala linnavalitsustega projekti raames ja ta on nagu praeguse maani on kõige enim kasutatud tarkvaraplatvorm Eesti asumiseltside seas. Ja sellega vist aitäh, Henri! Ja viimasena räägib Hille. Hille räägib kodupildist. Ja siis... Ja, ma ütlen. Ikka siin kuskil. Ei. See äkki. Ei, avaslaid ei ole. See ei ole. See ei ole. Desktop.
Jah, siin.
See.
Vot just. Suureks ka. Tervist! Linnaideega olen seotud vabatahtlikuna, Community Toolsi olen kasutanud oma MTÜs Pärnus, nii et täielik hands-on praktika on olemas. Slaidid on mul inglise keeles ja need on siis mõeldud Steveni jaoks, sest sain aru, et tema eesti keelt ei valda, aga räägin teile täpselt sama juttu eesti keeles üle. Ja räägin siis sellest, mida Praxisega tegime, ei saa öelda, et ainult Praxis, meil oli pundis veel inimesi ka näiteks Geomeedia ja mida me siis tegime sellise saidiga nagu kodupilt.ee ja see pealkiri siin ütleb, et see visualiseerib ehk näitab pildina andmeid või näitajaid, et milleks on suutelised kohalikud omavalitsused. Capacity tähendab võimekust ja me näitasime siis seda võimekust kohalike avalike teenuste pakkumise kaudu. Ja selline on siis pilt, ma ei usu, et te seda lugeda praegu siit näete, aga kui te saate oma arvutites teha selle saidi lahti, siis te saate ise seda vaadata ja tegu on siis interaktiivse andmevisualiseerimisega, nii et saate ka oma tahtsi teha valikuid. Aga kõigepealt ma räägin sellest, miks me seda tegime, et Praxis ju töötab poliitika valdkondadega. Me töötame sellega, et me analüüsime, mis juhtub ja mis võiks juhtuda näiteks hariduses, tervishoius, sotsiaalpoliitikas, tööturu vallas ja siis ka riigi valitsemises ja kodanikuühiskonnas, millega mina töötan. Ja alatine häda on see, et meil on jube palju infot, meil on tohutu palju andmeid või ütleme mitte meil, aga me teame, kus neid kätte saada, on avalikult täiesti olemas ühes või teises ka Statistikaametis või mingis andmebaasis või registris. No ütleme niimoodi, et minu kolleegid analüütikud oskavad neid päris hästi sealt välja lugeda. Ja häda siis tuleb sellest, et kuidas seda seletada, kuidas seda näidata, selgitada, viia nii-öelda tavalise inimeseni, selle sama kohaliku elanikuni või kas või minu poolest siis nende poliitikate tegijateni. Ja kodupilt algas sellest 1-2 aastat tagasi, et teema, millega Eesti siiamaani ei ole veel väga häid lahendusi leidnud, on seesama haldusreform. Ehk mida teha kohalike omavalitsustega nii, et nad oleksid võimekamad, et nad saaksid paremal viisil pakkuda neid avalikke teenuseid ja oma eluga toime tulla. Ja me tükk aega kogu aeg käisime nagu kassid ümber palava pudru ja ei olnud nagu sellist head viisi, kuidas meie saaks sellesse kavasse või sellesse diskussiooni sekkuda. Ja siis me katsetasime seda pildistada, seda olukorda. Et siin on tegu tegelikult nagu, ma ei saa öelda praegu, sest see tehti 2012, aga ütleme siis hetke olukorra ülevaatega ehk tuua pildilisel kujul, visuaalsel kujul kasutajani erinevaid andmeid. Ja nüüd siis korra näitan, mis andmed seal on ja Steven saab lugeda, et praeguse seisuga siis on tehtud kaardirakendus, kuhu on pandud valik erinevaid näitajaid ehk siis erinevaid kvantitatiivseid andmeid avalike teenuste kohta. Need on 4 valdkonnas pluss rahaline mõõde. Need 4 valdkonda on siis asjad, mille üle on kohalikul omavalitsusel otsustamise õigus. See on siis, me nimetame seda keskkonnaks, aga tegu on kommunaalteenustega, vee- ja jäätmekäitlus ja soojamajandus, küte. Siis me näitame hooldusvaldkonda ja siin näitame hooldushaiglaid, hoolekandeteenuseid ja oleme pannud nüüd lisaks väga värskelt ka juurde apteegid ja perearstikeskused. Et need ei ole mitte kohaliku omavalitsuse osutada, aga nad on inimesele väga olulised ja lähedal olevad asjad. Siis me võtsime hariduse valdkonnast ja näitame siis seda, et millised on need koolid, lasteaiad, õppeasutused ja natukene ka selliseid näitajad, nagu näiteks lõpueksami tulemused kooliti ja näiteks ka see, et kui palju on õpetajaid või lasteaiakasvatajaid lapse kohta. Ja siis on valdkond nimega kogukond, kuhu me oleme pannud siis jällegi kaardi peale ja pildi peale kogukonnakeskused, näiteks siis külamajad ja külavanemad, neid muidugi Tallinnas ei ole, aga et jällegi inimestele nagu lähedale tuua see, et kus on kokkusaamise koht ja kes võiks olla kõige lähem asjamees, kes aitab kohalikku elu edendada. Ja ka spordikeskused panime siia kaardi peale. Ja finantsandmed siis võtsime juurde nagu sellise taustana või pildi loomisena, näiteks siis maksutulud ühe elaniku kohta, annab väga hea võrdluse, ja investeeringud jällegi elaniku kohta. Need kõik sellised arvud me oleme ära teinud suhtarvudeks, et me ei ütle, et Tallinnas on nii palju raha ja Piirissaares on nii väike raha, vaid oleme selle tõlgendanud ära siis kõikide nende kuludega, et just elaniku kohta selles konkreetses vallas või linnas. Ja mida siis inimene saab teha, sest ma alustasin juttu sellest, et meie tahtsime ligineda tervikule, me tahtsime näidata seda olukorda üle Eesti ja anda siis võimaluse võrdlemiseks. Et inimene saab esiteks vaadata oma kodukoha järgi, kodukoht tähendab siis ikkagi valla või linna territooriumit, ei saa minna asumiseltsi või piirkonna peale praegu veel. Et ta saab kas Tallinna või siis oma valla või oma vanaema koduvalla või oma sõbra koduvalla kaudu ligineda ja vaadata siis seda konkreetset omavalitsust ja võrrelda seda suvalise muu omavalitsusega Eestis. Ja saab ka teada maakonna keskmise, täpselt nende samade näitajate lõikes, millest ma rääkisin. Et on võimalik vaadata, kui palju ma peaksin maksma oma lähisugulase hoolduse eest minule kõige lähemas olevas hooldekodus või kui palju on lapsi minule kõige lähemas olevas lasteaias, selle õpetaja või lasteaiakasvataja kohta, ehk kas see rühma suurus on mulle mugav ja sobilik. Ja see pealkiri side effects tähendab kõrvalmõjusid. Et see on võib-olla see, millele me ei osanud tulla, et me ei osanud nagu aimata või oleme tagantjärgi seda tarkusena nagu enda jaoks põhjendanud, et milleks selline sait veel vajalik on. Et üks on see, et me hirmsasti tahaks nende andmetega edasi tegeleda. See on päris keeruline, sest kõik see on suhteliselt käsitöö. Et sa pead panema nad Excelitesse ja siis patsiga poiss tõmbab nad endale kujundusfaili ja pistab nad üles. Et kui saaks nendest ametiasutustest, nendest registritest, nendest andmebaasidest nii-öelda striimi ehk automaatse infovoo, mida arvuti oskab lugeda, oleks elu poole lihtsam, saaksime ka teha neid uuendusi, sest jällegi ütlen, kui andmed on 2012 seisuga avalikud, siis tuleb kogu aeg signaale, et asjad ei ole enam päris nii, nagu teie siin näitate. Ja selleks me peaksime iga kord tegema siis nagu selle uuenduse, et tahaks seda automaatseks saada. Tuleb nähtavasti tööd teha selle nimel. Ja siis me loodamegi, et see nii-öelda praegune puudujääk muutub siis plussiks, et kui on võimalik, et saada siis seda infovoogu kätte, siis me hea meelega uuendame neid andmeid niimoodi terviklikult ja paneme sinna ka uusi asju juurde, nagu ma mainisin, et perearstikeskused ja apteegid on siis meil ühe teise projekti tarvis ja selle käigus sinna juba juurde lisatud. Siis me ei ole päris rahul sellega, et on ainult tervikpilt loodud, see on tegelikult esimene samm või annab sellise tausta ja sellise võrdluspildi. Et kui me tahaks edasi minna selle kõige valusama, selle konnasilmaga, et mis siis nagu teha omavalitsustes, kus ei ole seda suutlikkust ja ei saa pakkuda neid teenuseid nagu nii hästi, nagu elanikud tahavad. Et siis tegelikult tuleks võtta sealt välja mingisugune üks kindel fookusteema ja siis seda näidata nii visuaalis kui ka loomulikult ajada aktiivselt nii-öelda seda poliitikat siis vastava omanikuga, ükskõik kas tegu on siis hoolekandega või tervishoiuga või mingi haridusvaldkonna küsimusega, et nii-öelda minna barrikaadidele ühe konkreetse asjaga ja näidata neid andmeid siis, mis seda praegust olukorda väga selgelt demonstreerivad. Et see minu poolt praegu kõik.
Aitäh, Hille. Istun kohale, jah. Eesti inimesed maksavad umbes 50% kogu see raha, mis nad teenivad, nad annavad meie riigi hüvanguks, eks ole. Pool raha annad ära. Ja siis on nagu väga kerge on tegelikult see rahulolematus tulema, et siis, et ma annan pool raha ära ja ikka teed saavad valmis alles enne valimisi. Ja samamoodi kõik riigi ja linnamed, kes siin töötavad, nad teavad, kui vähe neid ressursse tegelikult on ja kui raske on teha neid õigeid valikuid, et kuhu siis raha suunata. Ja ma usun, et need asjad, millest siin täna räägiti, need lahendused, mitmed neist aitavad teha neid õigeid otsuseid. Ja kui sa oled siis see poliitik ja jälle valimised lähenevad ja kui sinu valla võrdsusindeks on kodupildi tabelis tõusnud võrreldes naabervaldadega, küll need inimesed siis suga tagasi valivad. Nüüd on 5 minutit on veel aega lõunapausini, et teeme küsimuste ja vastuste vooru. Kui ikkagi on küsimusi. Kõikidele esinejatele.
Randel Länts, Viljandi linnavolikogu, aga küsimus on siis Tallinna kohta. Seesama see meie Tallinn, mida te tutvustasite, et ma küsin, et kas on ka venekeelne lahendus sellele või on see plaanis tulevikus?
Tal on olemas venekeelne lahendus niimoodi, et siin on võimalik teksti sisestada vene keeles ja siis nii-öelda kõik need disaini elemendid, mis on muidu eesti keeles, on lisapostitus, et see on vene keeles, tuleb lisapostitus, et põhimõtteliselt on olemas vene keeles. Aga ta on täpselt samamoodi nagu teised sotsiaalvõrgustikud, et see sisu on endiselt nii, nagu ta sisestatakse, lihtsalt see disainikeel muutub. Kas oli arusaadav vastus? Kas on jaa, saab. Et kui keegi sisestab selle postituse vene keeles, siis ta on seal vene keeles. Et ta täpselt niimoodi ongi. Ja meil on tegelikult see algusest saadik on tehtud niimoodi, et seal oleks võimalikult vähe üldse mingisugust muud teksti peale selle sisu teksti. Ehk see tegelikult seal ongi need linnaosade nimed ja siis on just lisapostitus, on ka vist eesti keeles. Tegelikult seal sellist nagu, et ta on nagu, ta lisaks ta on nagu ka veel inglise keeles olemas meil ja saksa keeles. Et on küll.
Mul on küsimus Illele, et väga huvitav tööriist, et kui palju teil praegu on külastajaid ja kuidas te promote oma seda niisugust väga head veebilehte? Jah, siis...
Külastajatega on nagu ikka, et Google Statistics näitab väga selgelt, et alguses, kui sa teed asja valmis ja lükkad üles pressiteate ja levitad seda ja lehvitad, siis teeb niisuguse jõnksu. Ja siis jääb kuskile tasasele sellisele plaanile, et ma usun, et see on paljude saitidega täpselt samamoodi. Enne kohalike omavalitsuste valimisi, kui üsna palju rääkisime ajakirjanduses, ütleme siis nendel teemadel, siis jälle näitas selliseid väikseid jõnksusid. Pean ütlema, et hetkel ma seda niisugust keskmist kasutajanumbrit lihtsalt peast ei mäleta, sest ma jälgin 4 saidi statistikat ja mul ei ole see mälus olemas. Aga vaatan järgi ja Liia, ütlen sulle vaheajal.
Ivar Talla, ma küsiksin tähendab ka selle sama Randeli jutu jätkuks, et tegelikult my question would be to Steven. Hey Steven, you're listening to me. No, I think what we saw from your community level was that there were really people from many nationalities. Well, okay, they were probably Americans, but from many ethnic backgrounds. And this kind of very local level seems to be one of the best where people could communicate without prejudices. And what we saw here in this Tallinn 22 groups, but it's all Estonian. Actually, Tallinn is half and half, Russian-speaking, Estonian-speaking, if we think of the population. Can't we use, and do you think, do you have an idea what tricks to use to get the other community also engaged? Because we understood from them that basically they have the ability to use the Russian language and so on, but there isn't anything. So how do we get engagement from other groups?
It's a really big question. So on my final slide, I talked about forum engagement. So it's one thing to get people into the room. It's another thing for that space to be relevant and welcoming and be a place where that diversity that we've recruited raises their voice. But so the key lesson for us in terms of getting people in the room is just ask. And so what we did was we mapped out community festivals. We mapped out different folks that had connections to ethnic organizations, and we got to them, often in person, and signed them up. Now, this is the challenge, is that Facebook is loved by silos of ethnic communities. So the Somali community uses it very actively, and so do the Liberians. But the Somalis and the Liberians don't talk to each other, right? So you have trust that exists. And so the question would be, how can you do outreach into Facebook to the people who are, I call hubs, the ones that have a lot of people as friends, and how could you pull them into an online space? But the number one lesson is that, and this comes out of that Pew survey as well, is that essentially lower income, people who are less likely to vote, people of color are not asked to be e-activists by not NGOs and others. And we just said, well, let's ask. Now, the challenge for us going forward is that while in St. Paul we have much greater diversity, we have found that in lower income communities, the spaces tend to be more announcement-oriented and less discussion-oriented. And that's less to do with race and more to do with people working 2 jobs or not having as good of internet access. Or we have neighborhoods that I would call them have a large creative class, people who are artists or writers, and they're very talky. They talk. So I don't have all the solutions, but just asking and then having that simple thing, which is an email hook, where you have as an organization the right or the ability to always tell people what's new, even if it's once a week or once a month, and not allowing Facebook or Twitter to be your only interface. Because then they could change a feature tomorrow, and all that labor that went into getting them to like you can't connect with them. And so I think it's important to mix up your technology.
Thank you. See oligi, see on väga hea, nüüd ongi lõunapaus hakkab nüüd peale, see ongi see küsimus, millega lõpetada, mis tegelikult alati õhku jääb, et kuidas sa need inimesed saad sinna. Et tegelikult see tehnika on 20% sellest, kuigi see on esimene takistuskivi ja harva saadakse sellestki üle. aga et see, kuidas kõik need järgmised sinna saada, see ongi see küsimus. Räägime sellest lõuna ajal.
Ootame siis kõiki siia tagasi 12.15 ja lõuna on serveeritud siin meile kohe, kui me välja läheme siis selles esimeses ruumis.